When a wealthy woman demands that Big Shaq leave his own jewelry store, she unknowingly sets off a chain reaction that shakes the entire city. What happens next? A silent protest, a public reckoning, and a moment that changes everything. Power is shifting, and she's about to learn that some doors close forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. A warm sun cast golden reflections off the polished glass exterior of Big Shaq's fine jewelry, an upscale boutique in one of the city's most prestigious shopping districts. The name alone carried weight. Shaquille O'Neal, a man known for his larger-than-life presence, had now stepped into the world of high-end luxury jewelry. But this wasn't just another celebrity vanity project. Shaq had spent years studying the business, investing in top-tier artisans, and collaborating with underrated yet talented designers. His vision? To create a space where luxury met accessibility, where anyone, whether a multimillionaire or a hard-working couple, could walk in and find something meaningful. Inside, the store was a masterpiece of design. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, reflecting soft light over black marble flooring. Glass display cases lined the room, showcasing exquisite diamond necklaces, custom gold chains, and rare gemstone rings. Each piece told a story, crafted by artisans from diverse backgrounds, a fact Shaq was immensely proud of. At the center of it all, Shaq stood tall, his broad frame filling the space as he greeted guests personally. Dressed in a sleek, tailored navy blue suit, he was both a host and a businessman, flashing his signature warm yet commanding smile as he shook hands and exchanged pleasantries. "Welcome. Welcome," he boomed, laughing as he clapped a longtime friend on the shoulder. "Y'all gotta see these designs. Nothing but the best in here." The crowd was elite but diverse. NBA players, Hollywood celebrities, socialites, and even longtime jewelry collectors had shown up, eager to witness Shaq's new venture. Camera flashes sparked as journalists captured the moment, and luxury brand representatives eyed the store's unique collection with curiosity and a hint of wariness. Near the back of the store, where a platinum and sapphire collection was displayed, a small group of old-money elites gathered. Dressed in impeccably tailored attire, they observed the store with expressions that ranged from intrigue to thinly veiled skepticism. One woman, Margaret Sinclair, a longtime patron of high-end jewelry stores, leaned toward her husband. "It's different," she murmured, her tone careful. Her husband, Reginald, adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes scanning the room. "It certainly doesn't feel like the usual crowd," he noted, nodding toward a group of young athletes and their entourages, laughing as they admired the custom-made diamond watches. Margaret sighed, swirling the champagne in her glass. "I just hope it doesn't turn into a certain kind of establishment." A subtle tension rippled through the conversation. Nearby, Clarence Miller, one of Shaq's most trusted jewelers, overheard the remark. A seasoned craftsman in his late 50s, Clarence had seen this attitude before, the quiet, unspoken resistance to change, disguised as concern for exclusivity. Clarence exchanged a knowing glance with Devin Ross, a young up-and-coming jeweler who had worked tirelessly to earn a spot in Shaq's store. Devin, a sharp-eyed man in his early 30s, folded his arms. "You hear that?" he muttered. Clarence nodded. "Oh, I heard." Devin exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "They don't want us here. Not Shaq, not you, not me." Clarence chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "They don't have a choice." Meanwhile, Shaq moved toward the custom order section, where designers worked on personalizing luxury pieces for VIP clients. A man in a charcoal gray suit, representing a well-known jewelry empire, approached him with a forced smile. "Mr. O'Neal, I have to say this is an impressive setup. But I have to ask, what made you want to step into this industry? It's quite different from basketball." Shaq, unfazed, smiled. "Man, I've been in the jewelry game a long time, just on the other side of the counter." He gestured around. "But I didn't want just another jewelry store. I wanted to create something that opened doors instead of closing them." The man nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "And do you think your clientele aligns with the traditional luxury market?" Shaq's smile didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in his energy. "Let me tell you something," he said, voice steady. Luxury ain't about exclusion. It's about craftsmanship, storytelling, and respect. And that belongs to everybody. The man hesitated, then gave a polite nod before stepping away, clearly rethinking his assumptions. Just as Shaq turned to greet another guest, the store's double doors swung open. A tall, elegantly dressed woman in her mid-50s strode in, her presence commanding yet cold. She wore a cream-colored designer dress, paired with a pearl necklace and diamond earrings that likely cost as much as a small house. Her expression was neutral, but her sharp blue eyes held an unmistakable air of judgment. Vivian Lancaster, a name that carried weight among the city's wealthiest social circles. A woman known for her ruthless standards and deep connections in the luxury world. Shaq immediately recognized her, not because he had ever met her, but because he knew her type. Vivian stepped forward, her posture perfectly poised, scanning the room as though assessing whether it was worthy of her presence. Behind her trailed a younger woman, her daughter-in-law Emily, who looked far more uncomfortable. Devon, still near the back, nudged Clarence. "You see who just walked in?" Clarence's expression darkened. "Yeah, and I don't like it." Vivian made her way to the most expensive section of the store, inspecting the diamonds with mild interest but never quite engaging. Instead, she leaned slightly toward Emily and murmured, "It's different, isn't it?" Emily hesitated before nodding slightly. "I suppose." Vivian's gaze flicked toward the staff, then to the guests. "Not quite what I expected." Her voice was quiet, but Shaq heard it. He didn't react. Not yet. He had dealt with people like her before, the ones who walked into a space expecting to own it without ever having to say so. But what he didn't know was that Vivian Lancaster wasn't just another customer. She was about to be the storm that tested everything he built. And this was just the beginning. The double doors of Big Shaq's fine jewelry swung open with the slightest push, their smooth, gold-plated handles gleaming under the bright showroom lights. A crisp gust of air followed as Vivian Lancaster stepped inside, her presence sharp and commanding, though wrapped in an air of effortless superiority. Dressed in a cream-colored designer dress, tailored to perfection, she carried herself with the grace of old money, the kind that never needed to announce itself, only to be recognized. Around her slender, diamond-adorned wrist, a watch that cost as much as a sports car glinted under the chandeliers, and her signature pearl necklace rested just below the elegant slope of her collarbone. Trailing slightly behind her, Emily Lancaster, her daughter-in-law, moved with far less confidence. She was younger, in her early 30s, wearing a simple yet expensive silk blouse and pencil skirt. Her gaze darted around the store, a flicker of unease in her expression, though she said nothing. Vivian took a slow step forward, her eyes scanning the store with subtle scrutiny. The luxury was evident. The black marble floors, the custom lighting that made every jewel sparkle just a little brighter, the high-end clientele browsing with glasses of champagne in hand. And yet, something felt off to her. Her sharp blue eyes drifted to a young black couple admiring a set of matching platinum rings. The woman, dressed in an elegant navy blue dress, was laughing softly as her fiancé, wearing designer sneakers and a fitted blazer, held up one of the rings to the light, grinning. Vivian's lip curled ever so slightly, just for a moment, before she caught herself. She turned toward Emily, lowering her voice just enough to seem discreet but loud enough to be heard. "It's different, isn't it?" Emily hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "What do you mean?" Vivian gave a small, cold smile as she took a step forward. "It's not quite what I expected from a place like this. The clientele is varied." Emily said nothing. Vivian's eyes continued their slow, calculated sweep across the room. At the center of the store, near a display of custom diamond pendants, a tall, broad-shouldered man stood laughing with two staff members. His presence was impossible to miss, his deep voice carrying just enough to add to the room's energy, but not disrupt it. Vivian's gaze narrowed slightly. Shaquille O'Neal. But she didn't know that yet. Vivian turned to Emily with a slightly raised eyebrow. "I thought we were coming for a private shopping experience." Emily swallowed, glancing around. I think the store is just open to the public today. They must be celebrating the launch." Vivian sighed sharply. exhaling through her nose as if she had just stepped into the wrong room at an exclusive gala. She reached into her clutch, pulling out a delicate gold-rimmed pair of reading glasses, perching them on her nose as she inspected the jewelry displays. The diamonds were exquisite, the designs stunning, but her discomfort lingered. She turned toward a sales associate, a young woman in her mid-20s with auburn hair, and gave a polite but firm nod. "I assume there's a VIP section?" The woman hesitated before replying, her well-trained customer service smile never faltering. "We have a private consultation area, ma'am, but today we're celebrating the store's official launch, so we're keeping the space open for all our guests." Vivian's jaw tightened just slightly. "I see." The response wasn't rude, but it wasn't the one she had expected. She sighed, brushing off her irritation as she turned toward the nearest display case. Behind her, Emily took a nervous step forward. "Maybe we should just look around for a bit, Vivian. I'm sure they have—" Vivian's attention suddenly snapped back to Shaq, who was now chatting with an older black man, Clarence Miller, the store's lead jeweler. They were laughing about something, their energy warm, easy, unbothered. She watched as Shaq playfully nudged Clarence, then turned to a nearby customer and fist-bumped him, grinning as if he had known the man for years. Her discomfort grew. Vivian tilted her head slightly, her voice carefully controlled as she turned back to Emily. "Tell me, who exactly is in charge here?" Emily hesitated, looking toward the staff. I believe that gentleman might be one of the owners." Vivian's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Him?" She tried to mask her surprise, but it was clear as day. Shaq, now engaged in conversation with a young couple considering a custom piece, leaned down slightly to listen, nodding along with interest. The way he moved through the store, so familiar, so comfortable, made it seem as if he belonged there as a customer, not an owner. Vivian pressed her lips together before turning toward the sales associate again. "Excuse me," she said, her tone cool. "Who is the owner of this establishment?" The young woman smiled politely. "That would be Mr. O'Neal." Vivian blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Shaquille O'Neal, ma'am. He owns the store." Vivian's stomach twisted slightly. That name was familiar, of course. Basketball, wasn't it? But jewelry? She glanced back at Shaq, who had now moved toward the custom watch section, grinning as he tried on a limited edition diamond-encrusted piece. Vivian inhaled, adjusting her pearl necklace. A former athlete running an establishment like this? A place of class, refinement, exclusivity? She didn't say it aloud, but the thought was loud enough in her mind. Her fingers tapped lightly against the glass case, her expression unreadable. Shaq, meanwhile, had noticed Vivian's lingering stare. He wasn't a stranger to these kinds of looks, the ones that hovered between curiosity and quiet judgment. He had seen them in boardrooms, country clubs, high-end restaurants, and now, in his own store. He didn't react. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to Clarence, keeping his voice light. "Think she's gonna ask for me?" Clarence chuckled lowly, shaking his head. "Oh, she's definitely about to ask for you." Shaq smiled slightly. "Then I guess I better say hi." He took an easy step forward, his presence effortlessly commanding yet warm. Vivian, still standing stiffly near the diamond display, hadn't expected him to approach. But before she could stop it, there he was, standing directly in front of her. "Hey there, how you doing today?" Shaq greeted, his deep voice smooth and unshaken. Vivian blinked, caught off guard for half a second before regaining her composure. She cleared her throat. "I was looking for the owner." Shaq nodded, smile never fading. "Well, you found him." The room shifted. Vivian's lips parted slightly, her confidence faltering for just a moment. Then, ever so subtly, she straightened. And when she spoke next, her tone carried the same quiet dismissal that had been perfected over decades. "Oh, I see." And just like that, the first shot had been fired. Vivian Lancaster stood still for a moment, her carefully trained posture remaining perfectly poised. But her eyes gave her away. A flicker of something, disbelief, mild irritation, perhaps even discomfort, flashed across her face. She had expected a manager, maybe some overly eager sales associate desperate to cater to her every whim. But the owner? And not just any owner? Shaquille O'Neal? It didn't fit. Not in her world. Not here. Shaq, standing effortlessly at ease, was unbothered by her silence. He had spent a lifetime recognizing moments like these, the half-second delay before a response, the tightening of a jaw, the way someone's eyes lingered too long, questioning his presence. It was a familiar game, one he had stopped playing years ago. Vivian's face smoothed back into its usual expression of control, and whatever surprise had flickered in her gaze was quickly replaced with detached politeness. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging him as one might acknowledge a server at a five-star restaurant. Present, useful when necessary, but ultimately invisible once the job was done. Without another word, she turned her attention back to the jewelry case in front of her. Shaq remained where he was, unmoved. The weight of the moment was thinly veiled, but it was there. A quiet tension, pressing against the very air of the store, felt but unspoken. Vivian continued scanning the case, lifting a hand to adjust the delicate pearl necklace at her throat. Shaq recognized the move immediately, a silent dismissal. A well-practiced art among the social elite. A gesture meant to erase someone without ever having to acknowledge them in the first place. Clarence Miller, watching from a few feet away, felt the shift too. His years in the industry had given him an instinct for these things, how quickly power was assigned, how easily respect was granted or withheld. And in that moment, it was clear. Vivian didn't see Shaq as the owner of the store. She saw him as a guest overstaying his welcome. And she wasn't the only one. A few other well-dressed patrons had begun to notice the interaction, their conversations slowing, their glances shifting discreetly toward the exchange. Some whispered, some simply observed. But there was a pattern to it, a silent curiosity about how this moment would unfold. Shaq, as always, remained calm. He let a few seconds pass, allowing the moment to settle into itself. Then, in his usual easy manner, he gestured toward the display she was so intently examining. "Beautiful pieces, huh?" His voice was warm, effortlessly confident. "Got a few favorites in there myself." Vivian's lips tightened just slightly. The words themselves weren't offensive. They weren't confrontational. But the fact that he had spoken at all, that he had not disappeared into the background as she had expected, made something stiffen inside her. She turned toward him, her eyes carefully measured, the smallest flicker of condescension playing at the edges of her expression. "It's certainly an impressive collection," she said, her tone light but distant. "I imagine the real buyers will appreciate the craftsmanship." The words were deliberate. There was no raised voice, no outright hostility, nothing that could be pointed to as overt rudeness. And yet, the meaning sat there, heavy between them. Shaq had heard every version of this statement before. He knew the code. He knew what it meant when people like Vivian said, "real buyers" in places like this. Still, he remained composed. He let the words linger, let her believe for a brief moment that they had simply passed him by unnoticed. And then, with the kind of ease that only comes from complete self-assurance, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "What do you mean by that?" Vivian blinked just once. Clarence, still standing nearby, felt the shift immediately. This was the moment. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was happening. The air in the store had changed. The surrounding conversations, previously casual, fluid, began to quiet, guests pretending to be focused on displays, but in reality, listening intently. Vivian didn't like being questioned. She had built a life where she was the one who dictated the rules of engagement, where people adjusted their responses around her presence, not the other way around. She let out a breath that was too controlled, too careful, then gave a small, sharp smile. "I only meant that places like this cater to a certain standard of clientele." A few feet away, a young black couple, newly engaged, stiffened at her words. Devin, the young jeweler, standing by the counter, subtly set down the ring he had been polishing. Shaq, however, didn't react, not visibly. He simply nodded, letting her words settle between them. Then, with the same easy calm, he asked, "And what kind of clientele would that be?" The directness of the question took her off guard. Vivian had spent years navigating conversations without ever having to say what she truly meant. She dealt in implications, not confrontations. And yet, here was this man, standing before her, not playing along. A small flicker of irritation flashed across her face. "I'm sure you know what I mean," she said, keeping her tone even. Shaq smiled slightly, but it wasn't an amused smile. It was the kind of smile that carried centuries of understanding, the kind that men like him had worn in rooms like this for far too long. Still, he let her believe she was in control of the conversation. For now. Vivian, emboldened by what she assumed was his lack of resistance, let her shoulders relax slightly. Then, with a final dismissive glance at him, she lifted her hand toward the nearest associate. "I'd like to begin shopping now," she said smoothly. The young woman hesitated, glancing toward Shaq, unsure of what to do. Vivian followed her gaze, her expression subtly hardening. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation later," she said, voice clipped. "But for now, I'd really prefer to shop without distractions." The final word landed like a weight on the room. A few gasps were barely masked. Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably. Clarence's hand tightened into a fist for just a second before he exhaled, forcing himself to relax. Vivian had made a mistake. She had pushed too far. She didn't know it yet, but she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now, as the weight of her own words settled around her, the store stood in silence, waiting for Shaq's response. The moment hung in the air like a pulled bowstring, the next move waiting to be made. And in that moment, as eyes flickered between Vivian and the man she had just tried to erase, something became very, very clear. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a reckoning. For a moment, the store remained frozen in silence. The tension hung in the air, thick and unspoken, pressing against the walls of Big Shaq's fine jewelry like an invisible force. Customers had paused mid-conversation, their gazes flickering between Shaquille O'Neal and Vivian Lancaster, waiting for what would happen next. Shaq stood there, calm, composed, and unshaken. He had seen moments like this play out before, but there was something different about this one. Maybe it was because this was his space, built from his vision, designed to be a place of luxury and inclusion. And yet, here he was, being treated like an outsider. Vivian Lancaster, still standing rigidly near the diamond display, took in the silence around her, realizing that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one dictating the room's energy. Her polished exterior faltered for just a moment as she noticed the way the sales associates avoided her gaze, how other customers had turned their attention toward Shaq, waiting for him to respond. And then, Shaq smiled. Not a forced smile, not an angry one, just a small, knowing, steady smile. The kind that carried years of patience, the kind that came from understanding exactly what was happening and exactly how to handle it. With an effortless ease, he spoke, and with just a few words, he changed everything. As soon as Shaq revealed that he owned the store, something shifted in the air. The color drained from Vivian's face. Her fingers clenched around the gold clasp of her handbag. Her breath caught somewhere between shock and indignation. She had spent her entire life navigating exclusive spaces, moving through rooms where her wealth and status ensured control. But now, in this moment, control was slipping through her fingers. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed, no, she had been certain, that Shaq was nothing more than an oversized customer with too much money and too little refinement. The owner? Impossible. The realization seemed to rattle her, but only for a second. Vivian was not the type to shrink under pressure. Her entire existence had been built on never showing weakness. So instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging her misstep, she did what people like her always did. She doubled down. Vivian's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a tight line before curling into a forced, polite smile. It was the kind of smile meant to dismiss, not to acknowledge. She tilted her head slightly, as if suddenly evaluating him in a new way, as if trying to place him in a box that made more sense to her. Then, in a voice that dripped with condescension, she made her move. She questioned his credibility, not directly, not in a way that could be outright condemned, but subtly, with the precision of someone who had spent years disguising insults as observations. She implied that running a jewelry store required more than just wealth, more than just a name built from fame and entertainment. She spoke about heritage, expertise, and tradition, carefully crafting her words to suggest that a man like Shaq could never truly understand what it meant to curate fine jewelry. And the moment the words left her lips, the store changed. The whispers started immediately. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, their glances darting between Shaq and Vivian. Some murmured in agreement, their own biases quietly confirming her assumptions. Others frowned, their faces reflecting a growing unease with the way the conversation had turned. Clarence Miller, standing near the custom order section, let out a slow breath, shaking his head. He had seen this before, time and time again. The way people like Vivian could discredit a man without ever raising their voice, without ever using the wrong words, just the right ones, in the right tone. But Shaq was not the kind of man to be shaken by words. Instead of reacting with anger, instead of allowing Vivian to set the terms of engagement, Shaq remained exactly as he was, rooted, steady, immovable. He didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself, because he didn't need to. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He spoke with absolute certainty. He made it clear that this store, this business, was built on more than money, more than celebrity, more than anything Vivian could ever define. It was built on craftsmanship, on community, on a vision of inclusion that she could never comprehend. And then, in a tone that carried zero doubt, he did something that shattered any illusion of superiority she had left. He told her that discrimination has no place in his business, not just against him, not just against his staff, but against anyone who walked through these doors. And just like that, Vivian's influence crumbled. The weight of his words landed like a quiet thunderclap, echoing through the store in a way that made every single person feel it. Some customers looked away, suddenly fascinated with their phones, unwilling to be associated with the wrong side of history. Others stood taller, nodding in quiet approval. Emily Lancaster, still standing behind her mother-in-law, had gone pale, her gaze glued to the floor, clearly wishing she could disappear entirely. And Vivian? She stood there, her breath uneven, her grip tightening around the handle of her bag. The expression on her face wasn't just embarrassment, it was resentment. Resentment at being wrong. Resentment at being called out in a place where she assumed she was untouchable. She knew she had lost. Not just the argument, but the moment itself. Because the thing about people like Shaq, the thing people like Vivian always underestimated, was that they didn't need to prove themselves to anyone. They had already built the rooms where people like her once believed they belonged. A silent shift in power. Vivian inhaled, straightening her posture, attempting to salvage what little dignity she had left. She gave a tight, forced smile, one that held no warmth, no sincerity. Then, without another word, she turned back toward the jewelry case, as if the conversation had never happened. But it had, and the store knew it. Shaq didn't need to say anything more. He had already won. And as Vivian pretended to admire the jewelry in front of her, as if she could erase what had just happened, one thing became crystal clear. The room no longer belonged to her. It never had. A heavy silence hung over Big Shaq's fine jewelry, but it was no longer the sharp, uncomfortable tension from before. It was something different now, something older, heavier, and deeply rooted. The kind of silence that didn't just come from a single moment, but from history itself. Clarence Miller, standing near the custom order section, had felt the weight of this moment long before Shaq had even spoken. He had seen this kind of power dynamic play out before. A wealthy customer questioning the credibility of a black business owner, subtly suggesting that they didn't quite belong in a space like this. And it wasn't just any customer. It was Vivian Lancaster. The moment he saw her walk in, memories came rushing back. She wasn't just another elite socialite. She wasn't just some privileged woman who had wandered in expecting to be catered to. Number Clarence knew exactly who she was. Decades ago, before Big Shaq's fine jewelry even existed, Clarence's father had tried to build something in this very neighborhood. He had been a master jeweler, a craftsman with skills refined over years of dedication. His pieces sought after by clients across the city. He had saved, planned, and dreamed of opening his own storefront. a place where his legacy could live on through his work. But when the time came, when he was ready to purchase a space, the doors never opened for him. Every offer he made was mysteriously outbid. Every application he submitted was delayed, denied, or ignored. And behind all of it, the Lancasters. A well-connected, powerful family who had been instrumental in keeping black business owners out of the district, under the guise of preserving the area's exclusivity. Clarence had been young, but he had watched his father break under the weight of it. He had seen the frustration in his eyes, the way his hands that once created beauty, shook with exhaustion after yet another rejection. His father had never publicly fought back. He had been told over and over again that pushing too hard would make things worse. So he had let the dream go. And instead of owning his own store, he had spent the rest of his life working in someone else's. Clarence had moved on, or at least he had tried to. He had followed in his father's footsteps, working in jewelry, becoming an expert in his craft. He had found success, but the bitterness of that stolen dream had never truly left him. And now, all these years later, here was Vivian Lancaster, standing in front of him as if none of it had ever happened. She hadn't recognized him, of course. To her, Clarence was just another jeweler, another employee behind a counter, a man who existed only to serve. But Clarence recognized her, and he couldn't stay silent anymore. As the store settled into a new kind of quiet, Clarence stepped forward, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years. He told the story, not with anger, not with accusations, but with the raw truth of a man who had carried it for too long. He spoke of his father's dream, of the battles he had fought in rooms where the doors had been locked before he even arrived. He spoke of the names, the signatures on documents that had sealed his father's fate. And then, he looked directly at Vivian and told her, "Your family was part of it." Vivian's face remained impassive at first, but there was something new in her eyes now. Not guilt, not remorse, but a flicker of something else. Annoyance. A deep, simmering frustration at having the past dragged back into the present. Vivian exhaled slowly, her expression composed, but her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. And then she did what people like her always did when faced with an uncomfortable truth. She dismissed it. She called it ancient history, shaking her head as if it were nothing more than a relic of a world long gone. She said people needed to move on, that her family's past decisions had nothing to do with the world today. The words landed like a dull, heavy blow. Clarence had expected it, but that didn't make it sting any less. Because to her, this was just a moment in conversation. But to him, it was a lifetime of loss. Shaq had been listening the entire time. He had watched Vivian dismiss the past like it was nothing more than a story in a history book, something that didn't touch her reality. But he had also seen something else, the way customers shifted uncomfortably, realizing this wasn't just about jewelry anymore. The way Clarence stood, his hands steady, his voice even, refusing to let his father's story be erased. And he knew that this moment needed something more than words. So he made a decision. Not out of anger, not out of retaliation, but out of resolve. With a quiet nod to one of his staff members, Shaq walked over to the center of the store. He glanced at one of the largest display cases, filled with the most expensive pieces in the entire shop, and then did something that no one expected. He announced that the next collection Big Shaq's fine jewelry would release would be dedicated to Clarence's father, a special legacy line, inspired by the designs Clarence's father had once dreamed of selling in his own store. Not only that, a portion of the profits from that collection would go toward funding minority-owned jewelry businesses in the city. The reaction was instant. Customers murmured in approval. Staff members stood a little taller. And Clarence? Clarence closed his eyes for just a moment, taking in the weight of what had just been given back to him. Vivian stood frozen, her face unreadable, but Shaq didn't need to see her expression to know what she was feeling. He had done something she couldn't argue with, something she couldn't dismiss. He hadn't met her coldness with anger. He had met it with powerful, undeniable action. And there was nothing she could do to take that moment away. She had come into this store expecting to be treated like royalty. Instead, she had watched as the room shifted around her, as the power she once commanded slipped from her grasp. For the first time in her life, Vivian Lancaster wasn't the most important person in the room, and she had never felt smaller. A shift had taken place inside Big Shaq's fine jewelry, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came in silence. Vivian Lancaster still stood near the diamond display, but she was no longer the center of attention. The weight of her own words lingered in the air, unshaken by time or denial. She had dismissed the past as if it had no place in the present, brushed off an undeniable history as mere ancient events. And now, she was beginning to realize that for the first time in a long time, no one was listening to her anymore. Shaq had already made up his mind. There would be no argument, no justification, no need to convince her of anything. Some people, he had learned, didn't need to be debated. They needed to be shown exactly who held the power in the room. So instead of engaging, he made it simple. He turned to his staff, Clarence, Devon, the young sales associate by the entrance, and in a voice that was calm, steady, and final, he said, "We serve with dignity, or not at all." That was all it took. There was no discussion, no hesitation. The message was clear. Respect was not optional in this space. And then, one by one, his employees did something unexpected but undeniable. They simply stopped serving her. It happened so smoothly that at first, Vivian didn't even notice. She reached for a pair of diamond earrings on display, expecting the associate beside her to lean in and offer details, cut, clarity, price. But no explanation came. The young woman simply stepped away, adjusting a different display as if Vivian wasn't there. Confused, Vivian glanced at another associate, a sharply dressed young man near the emerald-cut engagement rings. She gestured lightly, expecting the usual eager response. Nothing. Not a word. Not a glance. It was as if she had become invisible. Her lips pressed together as she turned toward the counter, where a man in a tailored blazer had just stepped forward to make a purchase. The cashier greeted him warmly, walked him through his selection, carefully wrapped his new watch in a velvet-lined box. Vivian watched it all happen, her breath quickening. It wasn't that the store had stopped functioning. It had just stopped functioning for her. A flicker of discomfort spread across her face. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar. A sensation she had rarely encountered in her world of exclusivity and power. She felt dismissed. She reached for her handbag, adjusting it against her forearm, as if reasserting her presence, her status. "Excuse me," she said, directing her voice toward the nearest associate. No response. A muscle in her jaw tightened. She turned sharply toward another. "I'd like to see the emerald collection." Still nothing. It was happening. The entire store had turned its back on her. Vivian had never needed to fight for attention before. She was used to being the person who others catered to, the one whose presence commanded a room without effort. But now, she had become an afterthought in a space where she had expected to reign. The realization was sinking in, fast and unforgiving. She turned, scanning the room, expecting to catch the subtle, reassuring glances from other wealthy patrons. Surely there would be others who shared her discomfort, others who understood the exclusivity of places like this. But instead, she saw something far worse. She saw customers, all kinds of customers, still shopping, still conversing, still enjoying their experience, completely unaffected by her presence. The very people she had side-eyed when she first walked in, the young black couple near the platinum rings, the casually dressed athlete trying on a custom watch, the middle-aged woman wearing an outfit that didn't scream old money. They were all still here, and the store was thriving around them. Vivian's breath hitched. She refused to be ignored. She had not come here to be treated like this. With carefully controlled movements, she turned toward Shaq himself, expecting some form of resolution, some acknowledgement that this had gone too far. But what she saw only infuriated her more. Shaq stood near the entrance, talking to a young boy and his mother, showing the child a display of sports-inspired pendants. His posture was relaxed, his focus entirely on them. He wasn't watching her anymore. She was no longer the most important person in the room. She never had been. Her patience snapped. She demanded service, her voice rising slightly, sharp and authoritative, a last attempt to pull the store back into her control. Still, no one budged. A few customers stole glances at her, but they didn't engage. They didn't step in. They didn't agree. They just watched. Watched as a woman who had spent her life believing she belonged anywhere suddenly realized that belonging was not something you could demand. It was something you earned. And in this moment, in this store, she had lost the one thing she never thought she would lose: her influence. For the first time in a long time, Vivian Lancaster did not feel in control of the room she occupied. And so, she did the only thing left to do. She left. Not in a dramatic storm of outrage, not in a fiery exit filled with cutting remarks. She simply turned, her expression unreadable, and walked out of Big Shaq's fine jewelry. And as the doors swung shut behind her, something shifted in the atmosphere. A collective exhale. A silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. Shaq glanced up, just in time to see her disappear down the sidewalk. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because the message had been clear. This store, his store, was not a place where status dictated respect. It was a place where everyone belonged. And for the first time in her life, Vivian Lancaster had learned what it was like to be on the outside looking in. Vivian Lancaster had always been a woman who commanded respect. She walked into rooms expecting attention, speaking in tones that assumed authority, moving through life with the certainty that her place in the world was unchallenged. But that was before. Before she walked into Big Shaq's fine jewelry. Before she dismissed the wrong man in the wrong store. Before the world saw her do it. In the age of smartphones and instant media, nothing goes unseen. One of the customers inside the store, a local journalist who had stopped in to browse watches for his brother's wedding, had been standing near the engagement rings when the entire scene unfolded. At first, he had only been half listening, his focus on the designs in front of him. But then, the energy in the store changed. The tension thickened. The room stilled. And when Vivian spoke the words that silenced the store, when she dismissed Shaquille O'Neal in his own business, the journalist pressed record. The video wasn't edited or dramatized. It didn't need to be. It was raw, undeniable reality. A wealthy socialite looking down on a man she had assumed didn't belong, only to discover he owned the very place she tried to erase him from. And within hours, the world had seen it all. The clip spread faster than wildfire. At first, it stayed local, a few shares, a handful of comments. But then, bigger voices picked it up. News outlets, influencers, cultural commentators, all dissecting the layers of entitlement, racism, and quiet discrimination woven into that single interaction. People weren't just watching, they were angry. This is what privilege looks like. Not shouting, not slurs, just the quiet belief that some people don't belong. Shaq handled this with more grace than she deserved. Imagine thinking you have the right to decide who gets to exist in a space they built. I love that no one fought her, no one argued, they just turned their backs. She had to sit in that discomfort. Beautiful. But it wasn't just strangers on the internet who took notice. It was her people. The country club friends who suddenly stopped responding to her messages. The high-profile charity boards that subtly distanced themselves, afraid to be associated with controversy. The luxury boutiques where salespeople, once eager to serve her, now met her with polite indifference. And the worst part? It wasn't overt punishment. It was the slow, quiet unraveling of her social status, happening so subtly that she couldn't even pinpoint the moment it began. While Vivian's world began to shrink, Big Shaq's fine jewelry saw the opposite effect. The store, already successful, became something more. It became a symbol. Customers didn't just come for the jewelry. They came for the message it stood for. They came to support a place that welcomed everyone, a place that had reclaimed power from those who believed it only belonged to them. The waiting list for custom pieces tripled. The store had to hire more staff just to keep up. And through it all, Shaq remained the same. He didn't do press interviews. He didn't comment on the drama. Because he didn't need to. The world had already spoken for him. For days, Vivian stayed out of sight. She avoided the places she once frequented, knowing the stares, the whispers, the silent judgment would be there waiting for her. She thought about waiting it out, pretending nothing had happened, letting time erase the damage. But time wasn't on her side. And so, after a long silence, she made a decision. She would go back. Not to apologize, not to admit she was wrong, but to rewrite the narrative before it was too late. The doors to Big Shaq's fine jewelry swung open once more, just as they had before. But this time, Vivian wasn't greeted with warm smiles or polite nods. This time people noticed, not because she was respected, but because they all knew why she had returned. She walked in with the same poised elegance, wearing a crisp white designer suit, her posture as flawless as ever. But beneath it, there was something different. Not humility, not regret, but strategy. She was here to do what people like her always did, to take control of the story before it swallowed her whole. Vivian glided through the store, pretending not to notice the shift in energy. The way people whispered but didn't greet her. The way the employees acknowledged her presence but didn't rush to assist. She expected to see Shaq immediately. Expected him to step forward, engage, offer a handshake. Anything that would signal the world had forgiven her. But he wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't even watching. He was busy. And that, more than anything, made her breath hitch just slightly. Because if he wasn't paying attention to her, if he wasn't waiting for her to arrive, then her presence didn't matter here anymore. She had come to be seen, but instead, she had disappeared. She waited. She lingered near a case of sapphire rings, pretending to browse, giving him time to acknowledge her. But Shaq never came over, because Shaq didn't owe her anything. So she turned toward a staff member, a young woman with neatly braided hair, standing behind the diamond bracelet display. Vivian expected her to hesitate, to scramble, to rush to provide excellent service now that she had returned in grace. But instead, the woman's expression remained neutral. And her words? Polite, distant. Let us know if you need anything. Then, just like that, she moved on. And Vivian knew, without a doubt, that the moment was gone. She had come here to reclaim something. Instead, she had been reduced to nothing more than another customer. And for someone like Vivian Lancaster, that was the worst fate imaginable. For days, Vivian Lancaster had worked tirelessly to reclaim control over the narrative. She had returned to Big Shaq's fine jewelry expecting a moment of redemption, or at the very least acknowledgement. Instead, she had been met with indifference. The world had moved on without her, and for the first time in her life she wasn't sure how to move with it. Then, an invitation arrived. A formal envelope, heavy cardstock, her name embossed in deep gold lettering. It wasn't from the country club. It wasn't from the luxury brand events she once frequented. It was from Shaquille O'Neal. An invitation, not to a meeting, not to a staged conversation for the press, but to a charity gala, hosted in support of minority-owned businesses. An event highlighting the very entrepreneurs and craftsmen who had spent years being shut out of spaces like the one she had once dominated. The kind of people her family had worked to keep out. Vivian stared at the card for a long time. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a demand. It was simply an opportunity. And though she would never admit it aloud, she knew she couldn't afford to refuse it. Not because she cared. Not because she wanted to understand. But because the walls of her world were already closing in, and she couldn't risk falling further into irrelevance. And so, on the night of the gala, she arrived. Not as an honored guest, but as an outsider, stepping into a world that was never meant to serve her. Vivian had expected the usual, the polished elegance of a high society event, the staged networking, the carefully crafted ambiance designed to impress without effort. Instead, she stepped into something far more authentic. The ballroom was alive with color, with culture, with a vibrancy she had never experienced in her own circles. The music was lively, the laughter genuine, the conversations full of meaning rather than empty pleasantries. Everywhere she looked, there were business owners, designers, artists, innovators, each one standing in a space they had fought for. And in the middle of it all was Shaq, towering over the crowd, not as an untouchable celebrity, but as a man completely at home. He wasn't the center of attention, yet his presence was undeniable. Vivian had spent a lifetime believing that power was about dominance, about control. But here, power looked very different. It looked like community. It looked like inclusion. And for the first time in her life, she felt small in a way that had nothing to do with status, but everything to do with understanding. Then came the part she hadn't expected. A speaker took the stage, Clarence Miller. She recognized him immediately, the jeweler from Shaq's store, the man who had confronted her with a past she had refused to acknowledge. And now, here he was, standing before a crowd that hung onto every word he spoke. And so, for the first time, Vivian listened. Clarence didn't speak with bitterness. He didn't speak with resentment. He spoke with truth. He told the story of his father, a master craftsman, a man who had spent his life designing jewelry that rivaled the best in the industry, but had never been given a space to sell it. A man who had applied for loans that never got approved. A man who had put in offers on storefronts that were mysteriously outbid every time. A man who had eventually been forced to give up on his dream because the world had decided his presence wasn't welcome in it. Vivian knew where the story was going before Clarence even said it, and yet, when he finally spoke the words, it still hit her like a slow, crushing weight. And among the families who worked to keep him out was the Lancaster family. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Clarence wasn't angry. He wasn't looking for revenge or outrage. He was simply telling the truth. The kind of truth that couldn't be ignored anymore. Vivian had spent years perfecting the art of controlling a room. She had mastered the right words, the right tone, the right expression to always maintain an upper hand. But now, she had nothing to say. Because what argument could she make? That it wasn't her fault? That she hadn't been the one to sign the papers, the one to close the doors, the one to turn Clarence's father away? Maybe. But had she benefited from it? Yes. Had she continued to live in the world it had created for her? Yes. And had she just days ago dismissed that history as irrelevant and unimportant? Yes. For the first time, she saw the story not as an abstract injustice, not as a footnote in history. She saw it as a stolen future. She saw it in the lines of Clarence's face, in the quiet pain that still lingered in his voice. She saw it in the way the room listened to him with respect, a respect that her presence no longer commanded. Vivian didn't leave the event early. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't attempt to reclaim control. Instead, she simply stayed. For the first time in her life, she let herself feel the weight of the world she had once been blind to. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg for redemption. But she listened. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward understanding that some things could never be undone. But they could, perhaps, be changed. Vivian Lancaster had always lived in a world where power meant control. She had spent her life curating an image, shaping narratives, ensuring that she was never on the wrong side of history, at least not in a way that mattered. But now, history had caught up to her. For weeks after the gala, she remained silent. No public statements, no attempts to explain herself, no carefully crafted words designed to shift the blame. Because for the first time, she had come face to face with a reality she couldn't talk her way out of. Clarence's story had lodged itself into her mind, and no matter how much she tried to push it aside, it refused to be ignored. It wasn't about guilt. It was about reckoning with the fact that some things, once taken, can never be given back. No one knew when the money arrived. There was no press release, no grand announcement, no attempt to tie her name to philanthropy or redemption. One morning, an anonymous donation appeared, large enough to fund a full scholarship program for minority jewelers and designers. A program that would ensure that talented artisans, like Clarence's father once was, would never be shut out again. At first, there was speculation, but it didn't take long for people to figure out who had written the check. Vivian never confirmed it. She never denied it either. Because this wasn't about saving her reputation anymore. It was about quietly undoing, in the smallest way possible, the damage that had been done for generations. Would it ever be enough? Number. But it was a step. And sometimes, steps matter. While Vivian retreated from the spotlight, Big Shaq's fine jewelry continued to flourish. But something had changed. It was no longer just a luxury jewelry store. It was a symbol. A place where status did not dictate respect, where craftsmanship spoke louder than privilege, where everyone who walked through the doors knew they belonged. The clientele became more diverse, the stories behind the designs became more personal, and the message became clearer than ever. This was not just a business, it was a statement. A statement that people had heard loud and clear. Shaq never spoke about Vivian again. He never needed to. His actions had already said everything that needed to be said. He had met arrogance with composure. He had met prejudice with quiet defiance. And most importantly, he had proven that power was not in exclusion, but in creating a space where no one felt like an outsider. His response to discrimination had not been anger, it had been dignity. And that, more than anything, had inspired people. One morning, just before the store opened for the day, a new plaque was placed outside the entrance. Simple, elegant, unapologetic. It read, "A place for everyone." And this time, no one dared to question whether or not it was true. What would you do if you witnessed power being challenged in real time? This isn't just a story. It's a reflection of the world we live in. Who gets to belong? Who gets to decide? Some doors are meant to be opened for everyone. And sometimes the real change happens in silence. Keep watching. Keep questioning. Because the next moment like this, it could be yours to shape.